Hello there and welcome to Bruxelles Je t'aime, Euronews' weekly talk show that aspires to break down what's at stake for you and for Europe. I'm Maeve McMahon. Thanks for joining us. Coming up this week, it was a quiet one in Brussels. Halloween midterm meant many EU officials took a break. Showing no signs of slowing down, though, the bloodshed in the Middle East. We take a look at how hate crimes in Western Europe have intensified since October 7th and the atmosphere among Jewish and Arab communities who call Europe home. And one woman who did not put on her out of office this week was Ursula von der Leyen. The EU Commission President spent the week touring the Western Balkans. Stuffed in her pockets €6 billion and a growth plan to assure aspiring EU countries that they shouldn't feel ignored and that Brussels still has their back. We take a closer look with our panel this week. Sundus Boulam, Muslim social media influencer and the Chief Impact Officer at Brussels Global Review.
Hi.
Kim Smouter, Director General at the European Network Against Racism.
Hello.
And Fiona Lafrelashvili, Policy Analyst and EU Enlargement Expert from the think tank, the European Policy Centre.
Hello.
Welcome. So lovely to have you all with us here in our studio. Thank you so much. But before we get your views, let's just get some more context.
As Israel enters long war mode with Hamas, hate crimes against a number of communities have spiked in Europe. From verbal abuse in Germany to bomb threats in France, Jewish and Arab communities are on edge. Meanwhile, a new report from the EU Fundamental Rights Agency sheds light on the bigotry facing people of colour in the European Union. More and more Afro-Europeans say discrimination is a fact of daily life. As sectarian tensions rise in Europe, we ask ourselves what the EU can do to combat prejudice and build a more tolerant union.
Well, let's dive a little deeper into what we heard about there in that story about this spike in hate crimes and ask perhaps our panel, what are you seeing and hearing in your circles? Sundas, we start with you.
Sure. Well, first of all, I'd like to state that obviously there is no excuse for hating on an individual nor a community because of their religion, the color of their skin, their origin, anything really. But unfortunately what's happening is Europe has imported the conflict, or actually the genocide going on right now between Israel and Palestine. And there is a rise of hate crimes, but there is mainly a rise of anti-Zionism and not necessarily anti-Semitism. And I think this is a very important nuance to make, because while anti-Muslim hatred is being underlooked here in the EU, we have President Macron that made a speech to condemn anti-Semitism. And of course, it should be condemned, but the reality is that a lot of hatred and anger that is going on right now, especially amongst pro-Palestinian movements, has to do with being anti-Zionist and not being anti-Semitic. It's not a Muslims versus Jews narrative. It's a Israeli government versus the rest of the world, really.
Indeed, and it's worth pointing out that many people inside Israel do not support the tactics of their government, of Benjamin Netanyahu.
Exactly.
But let's hear the perspective from yourself, Kim, over at ENAR. I mean, how has your role changed in the last couple of weeks? What are you seeing on the ground?
Yeah, I think for us, what we're seeing is very much that there's a trauma. There's a trauma that's being experienced day in and day out. And that trauma is also being imported into Europe. And I think also it's really important to understand that the communities that are in Europe are, of course, closely linked to what's happening in Gaza and what's happening in Israel. It's for them, it's their cousins, it's their brothers, it's their sisters, it's their mothers that are being killed. And they're being asked to not say anything about it in order to ensure that we keep a level playing field here in Europe. So I think, indeed, that importing is very important. And but also, what we're seeing is very much a context which has already existed. It's pre-existed in Europe in terms of making sure that we isolate and alienate the Muslim communities, but also ensuring that, and also the alienation of Jewish communities. So that alienation is being perpetuated and being also accelerated, unfortunately, very much by the EU public discourse as well.
And Fiona, at the European Policy Centre, have you been studying how national governments and the European Union have been responding to the situation and the tensions here in Europe? And what's your take on what their reaction has been?
Well, indeed, I think that I agree with our panelists that indeed these are these traumas that were already existing here in Europe, and now what we are seeing is reviving of these traumas. And at the EPC, we are, of course, observing the situation. But the key point, I would say, here is the way how the national governments are also trying or not trying to implement the anti-discrimination laws that exist. And the EU has very much put a lot of investment. We know that there are many strategies at the EU level that are there to indeed eradicate such situation. However, the way how the national governments are also trying to implement and the information is not really clear towards the EU Commission. Of course, I'm not trying now here to not to blame put the blame on the EU side, but the point is that we need more coordinated approach in this respect.
But for now, we have each country and each city taking its own measures. Like in France, we've seen a number of movements have been outright banned, many people as well detained. I mean, how is this making people...
And also, I would also add that there is also a cultural sphere that has been impacted, right? So we have seen that the Book Fair Festival, of course, some of the important events have been postponed, those who have been critical, let's say, to Israeli government. So those this is also something to take into account.
If I may, I think you're being too kind to the EU, actually. Listen, I'm an EU lover, pro-European, all of that, but the reality is that the EU has not been taking anti-Muslim hatred and Islamophobia seriously. It's taken months and months and months for the EU to appoint a coordinator for anti-Muslim hatred, whereas there's always been a coordinator for anti-Semitism. In France, which is the country that has the biggest Jewish population, but also the biggest Muslim population, close to 9 million people, President Macron has never ever made a single speech nor shown clearly that he stood with French Muslims. If anything, there's been a lot of policies from the French government to show Muslims that they do not belong. So I think I know the EU is not doing enough to show Muslim Europeans that they do belong.
Coordinating role will be enough? Do you think
it's not enough? But it's definitely a nice symbol. And I met the newly appointed coordinator, Marion Lalisse, who's French, by the way, an amazing lady who's taking care of anti-Muslim hatred. I also like the symbolic that she's French, but it's just a showcase of, again, what we imported as well is that Muslim/Arab lives do not matter enough, but Jewish lives are very precious, and there has been a lot done on safeguarding Jewish lives. I've worked with Israeli/Jewish lobbies, I know that, and I'm all for it, but why tell another group of people, Muslims, but also black people, Roma, that their lives are not precious enough for presidents or Ursula von der Leyen?
And we also have a European Commissioner in charge of the European way of life. I mean, Margrethe Schinet. Yes. I mean, what message does that also send to minorities who live in Europe and have been brought up here in Europe and call Europe their home?
Yeah, and I think, in fact, the curtailing of freedom of expression, I don't think we would have allowed any other groups, aside from Muslim groups, to actually have that freedom of expression so curtailed, so egregiously. And I think that's indeed, as you say, it's very much the reflection that, it's not, one life is not the same life. And that's something which we're very much pushing for at ENAR. It's actually one of the biggest problems with this conflict is that we are not viewing lives at the same value. Exactly. The loss of life, any loss of life, is something which should be condemned. And what we saw, and which particularly the first reactions of the European institutions, was actually to give a blank check to say, because you have lost 200 lives, you're entitled to do whatever you want in Gaza. And now we see the results.
And this has been going on for 75 years. It's always been, okay, Jewish lives have been affected, so you can bomb Palestinians, you can commit a genocide. And by the way, this is what's really worrying with this anti-Semitic versus anti-Zionist narrative, is that the Israeli government and Israeli lobbies are marketing the Holocaust and using anti-Semitism as an excuse to themselves perpetrate a genocide right now against Palestinians.
But you have to be very clear here as well that the Jewish community here in Brussels or in Europe in general are feeling very targeted. If you look at the figures, Sundas from the French Interior Ministry, they said there have been 719 acts of anti-Semitic acts that were recorded in just 3 weeks since the 7th of October. And that's compared to 436 incidents in the whole of last year. And that's just incidents that were recorded. So, of course, we wanted to hear how Jews here in Belgium also were feeling. So we sent our Euronews Maria Sarah to speak to the chairman of the European Jewish Association.
The amount of Jews that going through serious fear in Europe now, it's something that we did not see for decades. For us, it's only expression of pure anti-Semitism. Because even if somebody have an issue with what is happening in the Middle East, Jewish people of Europe, they're not military representatives, they do not represent politics, they represent Jews themselves, This is normal civilians who live in Europe and deserve to live with a full freedom and safety. If all governments in Europe will be very strong and will send a very strong message, many people will be much more careful and will take care of their hatred with therapists and not by expressing it against other people.
Rabbi Margolan there on the situation in Europe. We know it's deteriorated in the United States as well, China, the United Kingdom. I mean, is it therapy we all need, Fiona, or is it, the problem is obviously much deeper than that? Is it education? Is it more diversity perhaps in the European Commission and in the institutions?
We need much deeper approach. So we cannot really approach this issue only. Of course, I agree with you that we can, of course, think about appointing the coordinators and trying to increase the portfolio of the commissioners. But we already have so many commissioners in charge of many other dossiers. And one of them is in Skinas, as you mentioned. So the problem is much deeper and it really much ingrained into European society. So we need much more efforts for the reconciliation, for the reintegration, for deeper understanding of the problem. So one-sided approach is not the solution, and the EU has to be careful in this respect as well to make sure that it plays a role that is a facilitator role that also brings the solutions on the table that we need now. Otherwise, the world is becoming very much dangerous and situation.
But we need to also acknowledge that, the EU has had anti-discrimination legislation covering Islamophobia, antisemitism, Afrophobia for more than 20 years. And the result of that is that what we see today. We see still communities which are feeling unsafe. We're still feeling governments which are taking actions to prevent the freedom of expression of minority groups. We still see that despite the fact that we have a commissioner, a fairly weak commissioner, I have to say, and also coordinators who are not given the right powers to actually influence and mainstream this legislation across all the different portfolios of the EU, we're seeing that this is a failure. And the EU fails to take stock of that and fails to put in the necessary political will and the necessary political funding.
Yes,
to
and it's political will. Yes, I think that is a very important part because political parties here play a huge role, and we see also the rise of the radical.
That was my next point.
But also political leaders at the local level, because we've been talking about France, and as I said, it's not just Macron, but have you ever seen a European leader taking stance against Afrophobia or against anti-Muslim hatred?
Yes, because we need politicians that have a longer-term vision and they are not dependent on the, let's say, short-term political dividends or advantages.
Or actually, and the reality on the ground, Sundus, is political parties that are taking a line against migrants, for example, or against different communities are actually doing very well in countries like Germany, in countries like Austria, Finland, Sweden. This, again, a big concern with European elections coming up next June.
But again, this is also why the narrative both of Western media and of political leaders matters, because when you have Ursula von der Leyen who stands with Israel and doesn't say anything for Palestinians, that sends a signal to Muslim/Arab communities in Europe that the EU doesn't care about them. Then when you have President Macron who made a speech recently to condemn anti-Semitism but not to condemn anti-Muslim hatred, that sends a signal again that Muslims
and
are
the EU
at fault.
then also losing its leverage there in finding a long-term solution to that crisis. But we mentioned earlier the EU Fundamental Rights Agency that's based over in Vienna. They've been keeping a situation, of course, on minorities in Europe for years and just recently put out their report, Being Black in the European Union, and seemingly nothing has improved since 2016. In fact, more people of African descent face ever more discrimination just because of the colour of their skin. And the situation, I believe, is worrying in Germany, Austria and Finland. Perhaps we start with you. I mean, over at ENAR, I'm sure you were studying that data. Probably not surprised, but shocked.
Not surprised at all, indeed, and also not shocked because it's exactly what we've been seeing. And I think the political environment, the political ambiance very much contributes to that. So as you were mentioning, the far right and parties which are espousing essentially policies which aim to discriminate, which aim to alienate, are being acknowledged. And also, even if they're not in power, actually a lot of parties are adopting the same language and the same lingo, and therefore mainstreaming that particular discourse. And the result of that is that individuals who are not asked for any of those kinds of violence are being particularly targeted, and those who are doing those attacks are being emboldened by political discourse, which essentially gives them a blank check to do so. There's much need for political parties and political leaders to understand that the environment that they are fostering is translating on the streets, and it is their responsibility.
Because as you said,
one thing that's really important to add, because you said those who perpetrate these violences, let's remember that anti-Semitism has its roots in Europe, not in the Middle East. It comes from white supremacy. So when you see today that French or European leaders say, oh, but there's a rise in anti-Semitism or hatred in general, but that comes from the colonial white mindset. And again, this is the same mindset that allows a government like Israel to consider that Arab Muslim lives are not as valuable as a country that was basically founded by Great Britain. That's how Israel.
And as Kim pointed out earlier, there are documents on the table. There are directives on the table regarding equality. There's also a coordinator in charge of fighting racism, a Finnish former basketball player, I believe. But of course, action needs to be taken back in the EU capitals in order for real change to happen. So we caught up with the EU Fundamental Rights Agency's expert Siobhan McInerney-Langford to hear what she wants to see come out of that report that her and her colleagues put together. What real actions? Take a listen.
Measures could include proportionate and dissuasive sanctions applicable to infringements of measures. Member states should work to raise awareness of rights and create a culture of respect for fundamental rights and encourage the reporting of racist incidents. And finally, that they should ensure that equality bodies and national human rights institutions have both the mandates and the resources to uphold EU equality law in member states.
Siobhan McInerney-Langford there, but why are these not being implemented? That's, of course, the question.
Political will, I think also access to funding and also resources. So we have actually equality bodies in each of the different member states which are responsible for enforcing the equality legislation, but they're understaffed, they're undermanned. And when they actually take a courageous stance, as they do, for example, in places like Belgium, what happens is that political leaders find that to be disturbing and therefore take efforts to actually dismantle the ability of these organizations to actually act on behalf of racialized communities. I think there's also a real important element around the ability of racialized communities to actually trust in police authorities, to actually act and to have their back. And I think that's the important thing, is that actually many racialized communities do not feel, and rightfully so, do not feel that politicians have their back. And therefore, there's underreporting of all kinds of discriminations. There's a lack of ability of communities to actually interact with authorities, to actually create an enabling environment which creates safety for racialized communities across
And not
Europe.
just that, there's even provocation, because now we're talking about the rise of these like anti-Muslim, anti-Semitist acts. But for the past years, why did European governments allow for Nazis to do marches and protests, like fascist protests? Why did they allow for people to burn the Quran? Like, why are they provoking these communities and then just initiating feelings of it's them versus us white Europeans? So why?
I mean, has this brought about a bit of reflection, do you feel, here in political circles, this latest data that we've seen there? We saw Finland as well, the Finnish press this week writing a lot of articles saying how shocked and embarrassed they feel, because at the same time they say Finland is trying to attract foreign workers, but who will move to an unknown country on the outskirts of Europe, quote, they say, that is known now for being one of the most racist countries in Europe.
Absolutely. So this is another source, I think, that will cause much deeper divisions that we will be facing in a very near future. And one point I wanted also to add is about the approach. So we need also a bottom-up approach, because when it comes to the implementation of the legislation and of the strategies, so very often it's not the community interests that are taken into account. So it's very much a political, administrative, top-down approach. And here we need also more efforts in the implementation, and also much efforts for the coordination at EU level, because the data as well and the survey that we have been discussing here, I have to also mention that the methodology is not necessarily thorough in a way. And why? Because the data itself is not sufficient, because we don't have enough data in public administration how to trace and to track the situation in this regard. So much work needs to be done. However, before, I would say that the most important is the political will. We need political leadership and political actors to make sure that the societies where we are living in European societies, it needs to be based on the integration, on the reconciliation, on common values that we all share in Europe here.
Yeah, for example, when you see that almost...
We're going to have to stop you there. I'm not sure the EU will be able to manage to do that. I'm sure it'll have to be as well much of a local effort. But
absolutely,
I'm afraid that is all we have time for on that topic. But do not go anywhere, because after the break, we'll have the latest on the EU Commission President's whistle-stop tour to the Western Balkans. See you soon. Welcome back to Brussels, my love, Euronews' weekend talk show. I'm Maeve McMahon, and along with my panel, we're taking a look through some of the headlines this week. One of them was the EU Commission President's trip to the Western Balkans. Ursula von der Leyen met with heads of North Macedonia, Bosnia and Herzegovina, Kosovo, Montenegro and Serbia. Her visit comes just 1 week before the European Commission presents major reports on the progress of these countries towards potential EU membership. To find out what the mood was around her visit and if locals still really care about joining the European Union, we spoke to Rainer Jarsma in Skopje.
They still want to join the EU, but just not as much as they used to. I think there's this underlying cynicism in the Balkans that the region only gets attention because of geopolitical developments elsewhere. But these countries have been stuck in the waiting room for so long that people in the region, they're hesitant to believe that there is genuine momentum or that there is indeed a real push for enlargement. That's also because when you look at von der Leyen's messaging at her speeches, you see that she's trying to emphasize, this genuine perspective. She praises these local reforms that the majority of the population doesn't actually really experience. And people wonder if EU officials actually know what's going on the ground in the region.
Rainer Jarsma there suggesting that EU officials are not really in touch with the reality on the ground. Fiona, we'll lean on you for this. You're our Western Balkans and enlargement expert around the table. Would you agree with that, or do you believe that the trip this week was a success?
Well, I think that this trip was a success to a certain extent because we are seeing a very concrete proposal that is a 6 billion package for the Western Balkans. However, one important point here is that everything is depending on the conditions. So it's conditionality-based approach, it's merit-based principles enlargement that we will be witnessing not very soon, I have to say, because I don't believe that enlargement will be happening in a few years because the EU needs to be ready for that. However, it is right time now to prepare for this framework, how the EU can prepare itself. But coming back to the visit itself, so I think that it's important that the Commission President has underlined and emphasized on the importance of the energy transition, on the green transition and an alignment to the EU's Green Deal. That is something that the Western Balkans have to also implement in order to get closer.
I'll just stop you there so we can take a look at a map, just to show our viewers. We can zoom in exactly on where the European Commission President spent her midterm break this week over in the Western Balkans, visiting North Macedonia, Albania, Kosovo, Serbia, Montenegro. Worth pointing out as well that Croatia was the last country to join the European Union back in 2013. Sundus, your perspective, because earlier we spoke a lot about money and the importance of money. We saw Ursula von der Leyen come with cash in hand, to the Western Balkans. Do you think if she didn't bring money and the prospect of growth and aligning perhaps with the single market here, that she might have been turned away?
I think it's the bare minimum that she would come and bring in money, because to be honest, what's happening with the Western Balkans is again discrimination towards countries that are so-called not fitting economic criteria. But let's remember that these criteria are fairly new. Originally, the EU was founded to keep states in peace. And when you have countries like Bosnia-Herzegovina that went through a genocide just 20 years ago, and you're telling them that they will have to wait decades probably to integrate this peaceful union, Ursula and the EU team behind the enlargement is sending the signal that the EU is no longer about peace, but it's really about economic interests. And there's a really interesting quote by Jean Monnet, one of the founders of the EU, that said, the EU will no longer be at peace if the states rebuild themselves on the premise of prestige politics and economic protection. And yet,
I would
this is
disagree
what's
here
happening.
Slightly, because the European Union, first of all, was founded as an economic union. So that was the economic interest of the countries that has led to the peace.
It wasn't for countries to stop killing each other.
Let's bring in Kim. We haven't heard from Kim. And then the gentleman around the table. Kim, I'd like also to hear your perspective on this.
Yeah, I think there's also this perception that somehow the Western Balkan electorate is somehow different from Central and Eastern Europeans and from Western Europeans. But actually, the Euroscepticism, it's also felt an experience here in Western Europe. So I think actually this kind of challenge as to whether the EU is actually capable of delivering, I think it's the same kinds of questions that we're asking ourselves. And I recently met actually with young political leaders from the Western Balkans, and I found them to be just as progressive as Western leaders. So I think the fact that we are holding them long forever, I think it's not a good thing. It's not a good thing for either for Western Europe or for Central and Eastern Europe in terms of political stability, but it's also not a good thing from a long-term geopolitical perspective.
Yes, but as we talk about here every week as well, the EU is perfectly imperfect in the sense it needs to fix itself, it needs to reform. Is the EU ready to enlarge in its current state and following EU summits that take place every month where there's so many divisions as well?
At this current stage, the EU is not ready to enlarge. However, as I mentioned, there is a framework in order to make sure that the countries can get in, and this is one of the ways the staged accession, the phased-in accession. That means that to give the incentives to the countries of the Western Balkans, but also to the countries of the Eastern Partnership, because we should not forget that the enlargement and this package that we will be reviewing very soon consists for the first time 10 countries that are enlargement countries. So this portfolio is increased. And when it comes to the criteria, of course, the criteria have been changed. Now we had the Copenhagen criteria, but the EU is being involved as well. And the EU is not a traditional political system. So this is a hybrid political system. And therefore, I don't want to say that it is normal that the countries are waiting, but of course there are concerns and this affects the citizens' expectations. However, the process will be long and we need to manage the expectations.
And these countries, of course, soon just do not want to see Ukraine jump the queue. Ukraine, Moldova, and of course Georgia, your country, who is also waiting impatiently perhaps to get in, with people in the streets. We've seen protesting a lot. But let's hear from you.
No, because I was really curious when you said the EU is not ready to enlarge, but that would go from the assumption that all the current EU countries fit this so-called specific, strict criteria. But when you have countries such as Hungary that are led by Orban, a fascist, and then when you have countries that are in economic crisis and are still members of the EU, that's sending a contradictory message.
We don't have Viktor Orban around the table to reply to that. I'm sure a lot of our Hungarian
viewers
would have a message for Sundas. We would love to have more Hungarians here around the table. Final thoughts with yourself, Kim?
Yeah, I mean, for me, it's exactly that. So I think if we look at kind of how the EU started, the EU was also building the plane as it fly. I think if we keep the Western Balkans outside, actually, there's more chances of those countries being captured by other political interests. And I think the EU has a lot more self-interest. From a self-interest perspective, it has a lot more to gain by having the Western Balkans in than out.
And the EU needs to go back.
And we've seen geographically where those countries lie. Beautiful countries, by the way, to visit. But I have to stop you there. We are, I'm afraid, out of time. Thank you so much for your views. We will get back to that topic very, very soon and follow as those reports come out. But for now, thank you so much for watching. Take care. Hello there, welcome back to Brussels, my love. I'm Maeve McMahon, and this week we have some of our own news to share. Today marks exactly 1 year since Brussels, my love appeared on your screens. To celebrate, allow me to take you behind the scenes of Brussels, my love, to introduce you to some of our stellar team working their magic and pressing all the right buttons. You should catch a glimpse there of our producers, Paul Lachoc-Upano and Louise Albertos, and Vinnie de Groote, our chief technician. Nothing would go on air on Euronews without them, and so many technical brains that you never got to see on air. And to quote Brian Adams, everything we do it for you. So thank you so much to our viewers for tuning in and reaching out all the time. Seriously, from Brazil to Barcelona, Cork to Corfu, we love hearing from you. So keep those comments coming into us, whether they're good, bad or ugly. We love hearing from you. This is all about you. So it's great to hear whether you think the show is interesting, thought-provoking, sometimes too one-sided. Sometimes people think it's very informative. Other people like to watch it to improve their English. Some people think they would like to come and be a guest themselves. Hopefully we can make that all happen. But thank you so much to you all for watching. And thanks, of course, without our guests, sure, we wouldn't be here either.
Well, thank you for inviting us. This is a great anniversary and congratulations.
And joyeux anniversaire.
Yeah, joyeux anniversaire.
Joyeux anniversaire, c'est magnifique.
Thank you so much. Isn't it nice to have something positive to celebrate sometimes with all the news that is pretty relentless, the news cycle. But of course, the name Brussels, my love, many people have inquired about that name. The idea, of course, was to discuss the ins and outs, so the good and bad of the very, very complex European Union. And of course, beyond the EU institutions, Brussels is a regular city in the middle of a small but complicated multilingual country that has no less than 9 health ministers. To find out how people here on the streets feel about the de facto EU capital, we took to the streets.
It's a lovely city, yeah. For example, this place is very beautiful and everything is very organized and clean.
Super sympa.
It's really great because everything is concentrated in the city center. There are a lot of museums and you can go everywhere by foot.
I feel like the people are very nice and they're very friendly. The weather is not the best.
J'aime bien Bruxelles. I really like Brussels. I was born here. But what I really don't like is the dirt. It gives a really bad image of the city. In fact, it's a lack of manner. People are dirty.
Expensive because it's a big city. We just paid €9 for 2 donuts.
A lot of people. It's too busy for me.
Safety, yes. I wouldn't walk alone in the streets.
Oui, j'aime bien. Yes, I like Brussels. That is why I live here. I'm Parisian. There is too much construction work, though, but Belgian people are amazing.
Sont extraordinaires.
For a small city, it is cosmopolitan in the sense that it gathers many cultures.
Very open for all kinds of cultures and ways of life. That's what we like most.
So mixed reactions there. And I know the city has branded itself as perfectly imperfect. Sundas, reaction to what you heard there?
Perfection doesn't exist, but I think this describes it well. Brussels has its downsides, but it really is an amazing city. And the name Brussels, my love, describes it well, because no relationship is perfect, but it's still beautiful.
Fiona?
I think that it is a great name that you have as a show, and it's true that it's very easy to fall in love in Brussels. It was also my case when I came here as a student at the College of Europe, and I never had an intention to live in Belgium, but then I came here for 1 year, and here I am.
And you're still here. It gets stuck under your
already
skin.
9 years.
Wow, that's a story you hear a lot.
However, I think that it's important to widen the Brussels bubble, and this is something that we should think about.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, for me, Brussels is an onion. So it has all kinds of different layers to it. It has all kinds of complexity to it. And I think a lot of people indeed stay in the European bubble and think it's an ugly city, but actually there are some beautiful parts of Brussels. But actually, the more you leave the Brussels bubble, the more you actually experience a real, beautiful, complex, imperfect city.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. I think there's just one job left for us all to do, which is blow out that candle and then tuck into one of these muffins. So thank you so much to our guests. And of course, thank you so much for watching. If you do have any more comments on today's shows or any topics you would like us to dive into, do reach out. Our email address is brusselsmylove@euronews.com. See you soon on Euronews and euronews.com.
It's amazing.
Congratulations.